Hello and welcome to Under the Mountain. My name is Anthony, and joined here today with a very special guest, Ottessa Moshfegh. Um, Brief introduction for Ottessa. Ottessa is the New York Times bestselling author of My Year of Rest and Relaxation, Death in Her Hands, and her most recent novel Lapvonia, which reads something like a medieval morality play gone off the rails. She has been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Man Booker Prize, and her novel Eileen won the Penn Hemingway Award for debut fiction. Born in Boston, Ottessa received an MFA in literary arts from Brown University, and she was a Wall Stegner Fellow in Fiction at Stanford University from 2013 to 2015. Ottessa has lived and worked in New York City, China, and joins us today from Southern California. Ottessa, welcome to Under the Mountain.
Thanks for having me.
Um, so I just want to go ahead and just start things off with a question. Uh, so as an author who often writes first person voice novels, what do you consider most important in determining how you inhabit each of your narrators?
Um, Good question. I think what's most important is that I find them interesting, you know, and that they represent something that I either want or don't want to experience in my own life. Um, for example, I didn't really like the protagonist narrator in My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I wouldn't want to be friends with her. She was kind of a harsh critic of character, but she was doing something that I think I was interested in, which was sleeping a lot. So I could sort of enter her mind space and occupy that space with energy fueled by something that came from within me. And in Lapvona, Lapvona is a little bit different because it's not a first person narrative, but there is a main character, quote unquote, who's an adolescent boy. And I chose him because I wanted to write a character that shared a similar physical attribute with me, and that was having this spinal issue, this deformity, and having the chronic pain because of it. And so it was interesting and very personal for me to imagine Marek as a character, and I could kind of like occupy him in his physicality as well. So it's, it can be a lot of things. There's just usually an entry point that gets me there. When I was writing my very first book, McGlue, which is a novella, I wrote it with a mirror behind the computer screen. And without really thinking, I think I had just moved into this place and I had put the mirror behind the desk and then sat down at the desk and just didn't move my computer. But what I noticed was that when I was writing, I physically changed. It was almost like I was acting out a part or practicing for a role in a play. When you're trying to conjure up the language of a character's own storytelling, you do kind of have to imagine how they fill space and what their reactions are and how they move, and how one thought leads to the next thought. And sometimes seeing that or practicing that in real time is helpful.
I remember reading once that Philip Roth said that whenever he started a new book, he always spent at least 40 or 50 pages getting the voice right before he even actually, I guess, started the story proper. Um,
Hmm.
do you find yourself having to do similar exercises or something like that when inhabiting, say, these voices or these different books? Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of practicing. Um, I can't say that I do what Roth did in, you know, 40 to 50 pages of getting the voice right, but I mean, the book doesn't really move forward until I have the voice right. So I'm basically rewriting things, and writing pieces of things and moving them, um, establishing the voices like, you know, sort of ground zero in a first person novel. And I should also say that, as much as I can practice, there's also just something that's like true about it. You know, a character's voice will come to me and I'll like, it'll feel like I'm hearing it, or like I had a dream about it. It's this intangible thing. The way that someone talks slash writes their own story, their approach, things that that voice conjures up for the reader, like all of those things are, you know, it's like a memory of a memory. And when you sit down to write it, you have to kind of channel that back into language. And that takes very careful writing, even a simple sentence, you know. Um, if I said, I woke up and I felt hungry, that I think that if I meant that, I believe a lot in like what's the intention behind a sentence. Is if you gave the same sentence, I woke up and I felt hungry, you give it to 20 different people and they all wrote it. Like I have this belief that it would feel different, every single time, each person's sentence, even if word for word it was exactly the same. So I believe in getting into character, but the revision and figuring things out along the way is, it's hard to separate that from, just also the spontaneous inspiration.
in that regard, do you feel like the voice determines the narrative of each of the books? Like, say, like that was, or do you have a story trajected beforehand?
Um, a little bit of both. I mean, I think that there's the voice that is this organic thing that is kind of off and running, and then there's the story that is my responsibility as the author, and I have to control the voice in order to tell, yes, the story that the character wants to present, but also the novel that I want to write. Um, and so I have to kind of be both the narrator and the author, and manipulate the storytelling in a certain way so that I can, make my novel mine. Um, because I'm not writing novels in the first person as though my character wrote them, they're compositions that are narrated by the character. Wait, let me put this a better way. Or maybe I don't need to. I think a lot of what goes into the novel, um, that only I do, as opposed to my narrator, is like thinking about, pacing, thinking about what to include and what not to include. Um, Thinking about the directionality of the story and the intensity and the, exposure of the narrator. It's it's one thing to have a narrator describing their life or telling a story, but there's the other level of it is what that narrator is saying, like in between the lines, what we can sort of deduce about the narrator, whether, you know, what they're saying is true or not, whether they are representing themselves honestly and frankly, or are they manipulating us? All of those things are these subtle movements that the author is responsible for. So while there's this voice that I kind of deliver, I'm also listening and judging and tempering it and manipulating it.
Sort of reminds me of what Nabokov would do with some of his novels, where it's sort of there's always the presence of the author, and sometimes he would play with that, where it's they're sort of manipulating things, even if it was a first person. There's the idea of like there's a shadow narrator behind that who you're not really supposed to see the necessarily the machinations of clearly. Um, well, I one thing that I was curious about with some of your influences, in particular, my year of rest and relaxation, was the idea of the like the Victorian Sleeping Beauty kind of, was that something that you were thinking of when you were writing that novel?
It definitely popped up. Um, yeah, it was one reference point, I would say, but it only kind of after I figured out that I was writing a book about a woman who tries to sleep for a year. It only really occurred to me after that. I was like, oh, this is like a trope. Uh,
Yeah, but it's interesting in that you know the two books that really come to mind when I think of that trope in some way are like the Japanese author Kawabata has this novella called House of Sleeping Beauties, which is all about a kind of like a brothel where men can spend the night with a sleeping woman. And then I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote this novel called Memories of My Melancholy Horrors, which is essentially a retelling of that. Um, Mentioning those because those are very much male centric viewpoints on this. It is the idea of fetishizing the sleeping beauty, which is interesting about um, my year of rest and relaxation because it's in some ways I feel like the novel is this narrator's attempt to escape that. And so it's subverting the idea of what you can do with this metamorphosis that can possibly happen with a sleeping beauty.
mm-hmm.
And which I think that makes that it's refreshing to have that, I suppose, in the canon of sleeping beauty novels is the not just be you know oh, the poor old man who thought they gave up on love until they, are being a creep and going to brothels where there's sleeping young girls. Um, is that something, I certainly don't want to pin you down in any one way, but is, I guess, that dynamic of that the sort of the power play of gender roles and expectations, does that something that was factors in particular, I would say uh I kind of almost view them as a trilogy of sorts, Eileen through Death in Her Hands. It seems like there is sort of a battle between the narrator and sort of like controlling male forces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's part of the world. I mean, it's been part of my life experience, so I don't see a human experience to be complete without it. Which is not to say that everything has to be about gender and power roles, but I guess it's just something that comes up a lot. I mean, not all of my short stories are really about that, and McGlue certainly wasn't about that. It was narrated by a male protagonist. So I wouldn't really say that I'm so much, yeah, I'm not focusing on that. I think it's just that I happened to publish 3 novels in a row, narrated by women, straight women mostly, kind of. Although Eileen, who knows really, that so that their attention to this question of gender isn't irrelevant. I mean, they're describing their experience of their lives, and they're all born in different times and different places. So it's, I don't know, a common theme in any story.
Yeah, well, I feel like Eileen, it really could have been anything. It just she needed something to, you know, knock her out of like this rut her life had become. So, something an ignition. And it's almost like it's sort of beside the point that it's whether it's a woman who does it or anyone. It's a personality that presented themselves that affected her in this way that caused her to get out of this town, get away from this life that's not really her. Um, so going off the speaking of historical settings, you frequently write within historical settings. Uh, Beyond research, what helps you in the now, so to speak, imagining and empathizing with the particular time periods that you choose for your stories?
Um, Honestly, I don't know. I like beyond research, there isn't really anything else I do. Um, I mean, except for the usual things that you do when you write, which is like to imagine the world that you're writing about. Um, Try to kind of experience it um, in your mind on every level, experience like an entire life and death, experience regular day-to-day things, take a walk, so I just do that, meant those sort of like mental exercises. um but I find that writing about any world, even if it was exactly like my immediate world, would take the same kind of imagining, because when you're writing about something, you're seeing it differently, like if someone was like, okay, you're going to have to write about this, you'd probably walk into the room and notice things in a different way. And so it's just kind of a mental setting rather than something I'm doing.
Was my year? Were you living in New York at the time while writing that?
I was not. I was, when I started the book, and when I say started, I mean like wrote a paragraph. I was in New York. I just spending like a month there one summer for work. But no, I mostly wrote that everywhere except New York. I worked on it in Paris. I worked on it in Oakland, California. I worked on it in all over New England. I worked on it in Montreal. And then I worked on it when I moved back to LA, and that's where I finished it. But I lived in New York City for years. I moved there when I was 17 and left when I was like 26 or 27 or 28. So I was there for a while.
Well, yeah, I asked because it just seems like it would be in some ways more difficult to write a book that is very also, in a lot of ways kind of about New York City
Mm-hmm.
or about a place while you're in the place. Because I guess like as you're saying, there's something to be said about having to imagine the place rather than just be in the place. Because I feel like
Yeah.
then you get too caught up in the particulars when you're there, because it's like you're not, you can never do it justice. You can never, you know, I guess unless you're James Joyce, pull off a Ulysses sort of like, bringing you like this is the street level of existence. Um, well, one of the things, it's interesting when I talk to people about some of your works, because uh, well, I tend to like poorly behaved main characters in general, just because I feel like they're much more interesting, and I feel like you don't get a lot out of well-adjusted, well-behaved narrators, because it's like, well, I'm not really learning anything from this. Um, so, and I know in some people that one of the things that was I've often run into is that people are um, confused by I guess like in their idea of what should happen in the ending of a story. Like what should be should there be a comeuppance for characters, or in some ways, something that uh I guess moralizes what's happening. And with that, I guess spoiler alert for anybody listening, but my year, I definitely talk to people like, well, why didn't she OD at the end of the book? Why did she get through this metamorphosis? And I find that such an odd thing, because for me, an ending, like, I've already decided if I like the book before I reach the end of the book. It's how it's executed. It does, the ending, it doesn't matter if there's a big climax or wedding or whatever. So I guess I would like to hear from you. Like, what do you think of as far as like, if you were to, someone asked you like, what do you think is a bad ending for a story? What would you think of?
Oh, anything predictable. I mean, if I can see the way that something ends, and unless like it has to be a really beautifully done ending for me to want to go ahead. Um, you know, it, I want, I think a predictable ending is kind of a bummer. And for me as a writer, the ending is always the place where I feel like I need to grow the most in order to know what to do. It's really where all of the growth kicks in. It's where everything that I've learned writing the book up until then takes on meaning. It's where I feel like art happens, is at the end of the book. And honestly, the way, yes, I decide how to end a book, but I don't feel like I'm in charge per se of what ideas come to me. So I can say no to things really easily, like, oh, why doesn't the character, it didn't even occur to me to end the book with the protagonist of My Year of Rest and Relaxation overdosing, because that would just make it a don't do drugs book, which is absolutely not what I intended to do. I mean, the whole book is resisting that narrative. And to be honest, we all know that doing too many drugs will kill you. You know, what happens is you do drugs and it kills you, or it doesn't. So there's no story that comes after it killed you, but the story of it doesn't kill you is interesting to me too. Sort of just side note. But yeah, so I think if I know how I want the book to end, I'm just not going to write it. I need to kind of be mystified and terrified of that. And I never really know. Like I'll kind of get an impression, almost like a psychic. It feels kind of like a psychic vision of the end. Maybe when I'm a quarter or a third of the way through a first draft. I'll be like, oh, I think that this image is going to be important, or somehow she's going to end up here, but I won't really know what happens. And so sometimes I feel like I'm writing toward that anxiously, like excited to discover how that ending takes shape. And other times I, remain completely baffled until I'm there. And then somehow, it always feels miraculous. Finishing a book always feels miraculous. And so I think there's probably also the adrenaline of getting to the end, combined with the story lifting off and sort of disappearing. That is always what I'm looking forward to. It's sort of like, that's one of the great payoffs of writing a novel.
What's interesting about that answer is, in some ways, that makes me it feels like you could almost be describing death in her hands in a way, is that there is this idea of, she is fascinated by this idea of like a story that doesn't kill her, and like, she needs to be mystified throughout it. And that's so like, it is almost, obviously it's already been brought to attention that, there's like the metaphysical, metafictional aspects of it. But I do think that is really interesting for that book, is sort of like a creation analogy in some ways. And, I'm just, for the sake of this interview, I'm just going to go ahead and talk more about endings, because I think that in some ways that's some of the more interesting things to talk about in terms of the whole work of each of your works. But like that, the showdown between Vesta and her dog at the end of that book, I thought that was terrific. So, like I said, mystifying in some way, of like, it's like, how did we get here? But then, once you start thinking about it, and it's just like, is this, I don't even really want to say, just because I feel like I would just be me filling in the blanks, but I think that it's a really fascinating, and, ominous ending we get to in that one. And so, well done, I suppose. But, through each of these books, and we've been kind of touching on, is this idea of, characters transgressing in some way, quote unquote transgressing. And as someone who I find the provocative in art sort of something that really draws me to works, and I feel like does do something. But I would like to hear what you think about the idea of transgressive art, and like, what do you think it does for us now in 2023, as opposed to, I think of the late 19th century, when we had a lot of the French decadent authors, and these ideas of pushing the taboo against the sort of the status quo morality.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't really know if I think in those terms, to be honest, because transgressive art is something that people are talking about when they talk about a bunch of art, right? It's not, and if you apply that label to a specific work of art, you're saying it belongs in this category of art. But when I am approaching my own art, I'm really just thinking about like my journey through becoming a better artist. And for me, that, like, what is powerful about art is it's a space to do things that have never been done before. So pushing against status quo is the only way to make any progress, and unless I'm just going to repeat myself over and over again, I'm going to be making progress. Maybe I will go backwards, but transgressing I just don't have, I think maybe I just like, I don't have that much respect for the quote unquote rules to feel like I'm actually transgressing anything. Like maybe I'm pointing out things that I want to dismantle or make fun of, but mostly I'm just trying to write the story that I'm interested in. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Do you ever second guess yourself sometimes? And because I mean, I don't have to tell you that your fiction often uh, takes on dark subject matter and stuff that you know um, for good reason. We live in more times where we're much more aware of you know content and how it affects people. So I just wonder, is that something that you consider at all when working?
Mm, I I know that there's this tendency to see things as dark, but I really wonder why people need to describe literature that way so much. It's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't either, but we watch things on television that are like so incredibly disturbing. And the darkness of it is like cool. It's like great. It's what makes it attractive. And it's totally mainstream. Um, but I wonder why the darkness of literature feels so much more dangerous and like risky, and like maybe I shouldn't like that. Um, I don't know. I don't know why that is. Do I consider the dark elements? Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to not be dark to other people. I don't know what I would write about that wouldn't be dark. I mean, what is not dark? Like
I mean, there.
we all die, we all feel pain, we all experience loss, we all want things, we all have private feelings. To deny all of that and write a story that isn't real in order to be above board in some moral way or something seems crazy and also dangerous, because if you're writing something that doesn't have darkness, you're fabricating a reality that is impossible. Um, and I kind of think living in those sort of impossible realities in terms of my own imagination is like more terrifying than being, real. Um, like living in a cartoon world or something.
Well, I'm one who believes that art is the place where we work through these things. This is the place where it's okay to go there, to consider things, and to be honest about certain truths in the world. You know, it's putting a band-aid on something and telling everything's a-okay, it's always has been okay. It's like it's not, doesn't do anyone any good. And so that's,
Mm.
for me, that's what the one of the big appeals of, I guess, horror, and also horror adjacent, if we have to say this. I have a very liberal definition of what horror is. I think most writers have something you can consider a horror novel if you really are paying attention, because it's a tool. It's a genuine feeling we have in dealing with the world. um, and one of the things that I think about, and it's like I find also odd that people consider a dark element of your works is the very corporal nature of it, which is the most, human quality about there is relatable, is that, your fiction is very bodily, and I mean that as a high compliment, because I love that. I love the tactility of the works. And so I guess, you know one of the things I am curious about is that something that has always, first off, been a fascination for you, the as in art and fiction and creativity, the physicality of being alive?
I think it has always been, for me, an interest in my own writing, but it's not the only writing or art that I like,
Of course,
you know.
yes.
I think it's just sort of like when if I was like, draw a picture, yeah, and you drew whatever was in your head, what's in my head is how we really physically experience things, and yet are sort of living in denial of our physical experience of things, and just how that confusion creates problems, is interesting to me. So yeah, I mean, I hope one day I'll be interested and like draw a totally different picture, because I believe in the variety of experience and, changing over time. I think, it's what I'm working on right now. I'm not thinking about that at all. And yet, it's still there, I can't really get away from it. It's just part of who I am in this phase of my life, I guess.
Um, on that subject too, I have a question actually from our friends at Thank You Books, a local Birmingham women-owned bookstore, great bookstore. They are big fans, and one of the questions they were curious about were, seeing that you are someone who has written a good deal about bodily and the human body in its various forms. How do you feel about the current conversation about AI generated art?
You know what? I am not totally engaging in the conversation, even just listening. I'm not really listening to it, but I and the reason is that, like, I feel like it's kind of an annoying conversation, because it's all speculation. Um, and I think that we like to be freaked out. And I find that I have enough anxiety just in my own life without thinking about other things, that I don't always want to participate in future tripping about things that don't really interest me, like AI. Um, I'm so much more into the past, like, to me, that's so much more mysterious. I don't know why. It doesn't really make sense when I think about what a mystery means, but the future is, yeah, kind of, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a millennial and early, like, I was born in 1981. To me, like, okay, I was born in 1981. I was a teenager in the 90s. Like, I grew up with like grunge, and like when alternative was like actually the alternative to mainstream, not like the thing you go shopping for at Urban Outfitters. And the future always seems perverse and tacky and cheap and lame. Like, it just always does. It's just what future means to me. So this conversation about AI and art generated by artificial intelligence, I'm very cynical, and I'm very dismissive. Like, I'm like, who gives a shit about what happens? you know um what do we care about what artificial intelligence does? it's not our intelligence. Like I'm not actually interested, you know?
No, sure.
And and I guess, yeah, it's, I'm sure a lot of it is personal taste. Um, but I'm more interested in like what my neighbor would paint if he was a painter. Because I don't really know him, but like I live right next to him and I see him every day. That's interesting to me. Like what a computer program makes up. I'm like, no, thank
Yeah.
you.
It kind of reminds me of, for me, like I've always been, I've never been particularly one interested in space or the idea of life in space. I'm like, have you seen the ocean? This thing's right over
Mm-hmm.
here, and we don't understand half of what's going on in there. It's like, why are you making up a mystery when we have a mystery right there?
Hmm.
Um, and that is kind of a way of looking at the past too, is that it is a mystery in that way. I mean, sure, we have, history books and, BBC adaptations of different times and such. But it's all just speculation to some degree, of terms of like what it is to have been this thing. But the difference between it and the AI is that it did happen. That is there. It's like, whereas the AI is just, I guess that could happen. I mean, who knows? Where it's like, but this did happen and it's still a mystery. And I do like, and that is something that I do like about your works is your engagement with the past. And in fact, my favorite work of yours so far has been your latest Labonia. I mean, it felt like one of those books that's like, okay, this person doesn't know me at all, but they're writing this for me, because it felt like something New Directions would have put out in the 60s or the 70s. Like, have you read John Hawkes?
A
Um,
while ago, yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, not y'all are very different authors, but it almost felt like this is something like John Hawkes would have written. I mean, just the sort of almost like kind of carnivalesque debauchery going on, in particular Willem, but like sort of just this kind of almost this world is just kind of like in this book is sort of hinged on this sort of everything just kind of being in flux and being people's like desires just playing out. And um was I know that book was written during the pandemic, but was that something that was already on the back burner for you? You'd already been thinking about before writing it, or was it something that sort of
No,
came out of that?
I was not expecting to write that book. Um, what I can say was that there's one way of talking about the book, and that it has this premise outside of time, and it's a sort of a family story. And I had this idea, and I couldn't put faces to the names of things yet, but it was okay. There's a family, and a boy gets killed by another boy, and then the family can't really accept it, so they take in that killer as their replacement son. Like it, I was like, why wouldn't that? Why wouldn't they be able to accept it? Why wouldn't they be able to go, for example, to the police and seek justice or whatever? And I was like, oh, maybe the family is like mafia, you know, or and that's sort of how the idea started. I mean, inevitably, like basically, it is kind of the mafia in Lapona. William is sort of mafioso, but that's all I had. That's all I had. So it was sort of like that like granular piece of a premise, and then the pandemic hit, and my imagination went in a completely different direction.
Well, I definitely I don't know what it says about me, but I think Villian might be my favorite of your characters so far, just for
Thanks.
how gross and I think funny he is and pathetic. Like I think those, what does that say about me? That those are all qualities I like in a character? I don't know, but it as far as talking about a book that's constantly surprising, I think that one definitely, like, in terms of it has that, because it's sort of episodic, smaller stories that build a main narrative, and I feel like that really gives it a lot of momentum. But One thing I was curious about is, have you found a lot of pushback against that novel because it's so different in a way than the novels that had come before it? Because that one is also much more male centric in terms of characters.
Oh, you think? Hmm. I mean, yeah, I guess Marek is the main character in Lapona. To me, it's like, to me, Lapona is really 50-50 in terms of
Hmm.
the male and female character, who gets the most real estate. But anyway, um, pushback is, I wouldn't say pushback. I would say that I noticed that there were many negative reviews about Lapona, and way less so than any other book. And maybe it's because the point of view shifted. Like, if I wrote about a woman's feelings in another book from the point of view of a woman, they might assign those reviews to women or people who would be sympathetic with the character. And so the content of the review might explore more about the book and its psychology or something. But I'm just guessing, like, because Lapona is a third person point of view and it's about a village. I guess it's sort of free range, is that the right word? I guess it's sort of like open in a way to be criticized however you feel like it, because it's supposed to be. I mean, there's this weird idea that third person is like objective. um yeah, so I felt like that book really got uh misunderstood, but I'm also so in love with the book that I just took all of those misunderstandings as personal insults. Because I'm like, well, it couldn't be because they didn't like the book. They must just hate me. um it's just so ridiculous. But it really is. Thank you for what you said about Lapona. It really is like the most personal book I've written. And ironically, because it's from third person point of view, yet I felt like I put so much of myself into that book and every single character, and really kind of laid it all out there in terms of how I feel about being human and being alive and being a part of the world. And people will pick it up and put it down if they want. There will be other books like My Year of Rest and Relaxation that they might like better. I'm just offering the next thing from me, which was that.
Well, as one reader, I would say that I genuinely found it was an exciting change for me. Like I think that because you know not this sounds odd to say, but I consider you a young author, and it's exciting to me to find an author who I like, and it's like, oh, they're just getting going. It's like I don't know what to expect next. It's like you're not just a one trick pony. It's like that's to me that's the worst thing is if you have an author who just writes the same book over and over and over in a way that feels like you're reading the same book.
Yeah.
So I think personally keep going at it for that kind of stuff. I mean, this reader will keep picking them up. And it's interesting just because I think the book that Latvonia also reminded me most of was McGlue in some
Mm-hmm.
ways. And I think McGlue was actually the first thing I read of yours. And I don't know what it was. Maybe I was also reading about the same time, but like I kept on thinking of like Rimbaud and Paul Verlaine's relationship when I was reading about McGlue and Johnson. This is
Mm.
I think that's probably says more about me, but I don't know. I think that that one's also just a really heady, short, sort of sad nightmare in a way.
It's a good
um,
way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, Lapvona is also a sad nightmare, but I think Lapvona is like more about violence and not so much about love. And McGlue, for me, remains a love story, really.
well, there's the carnivalesque aspect I think about Livonia, especially when you get to William's court,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that also that's why I think I compared it to something like from New Directions, like that sort of that black humor, that black absurdist humor that I feel like isn't as prevalent now. I'm not saying not everybody there's it doesn't still exist, but it certainly I don't think is as much in the I guess the serious literary conversation as it once was, or
Mm.
it's not as valued as much. So it was really exciting for me to see that because I always you know hope for more exciting things to come in general with fiction because it's not there certainly is no oh it's all going downhill now because you know I only read people from like the 1950s or whatever. um
I
but
totally understand.
yeah. Well, speaking about reading, one thing I always like to ask about too is like, is there anything that you've read recently that you feel like people should pay more attention to? And it doesn't have to be like horror or dark fiction or anything like that.
I have to say, I just reread the books of Akhil Sharma, including this one, Family Life, a novel, which was, I think it was his second book. His first book, An Obedient Father, when I read it when it had just come out, like really blew me away. And he also has a collection of short stories. He he's one of my favorite writers. Akhil Sharma is. And purely because his point of view feels completely unmired in bullshit. He feels to me like a pure soul, um, with an incredible sense of humor and incredible sensitivity. And he writes about families, and also loneliness and wanting to be part of life in a way that I relate to, and yet it just continues to astonish me. Like the first short story in his collection is about a man, I think he's retired, who's living alone now in some small town in America, and his wife has left him for her guru, and he ends up having a relationship with the woman next door who's like just like this complete stranger, and yet they have this weird intersection of need and desire. um yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't, I feel like I'm an idiot when I try to describe what Sharma does, but I think his writing is amazing.
Well, I certainly know that feeling. Like I think you did just fine. But when you're trying to explain to someone something that you feel strongly about, it's like, I need you to understand this
Mm-hmm.
the exact same way I'm going. But it's like, it's more of, it's almost like it's feelings you have more than necessarily of like, it's a clear explanation. It's like, well, because it makes me feel this way, and that's
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah.
Uh, well, Tessa, this has been a real delight to talk to you. Thank you for your time today. And
Thanks, Anthony.
yeah, and is there anything, when people will be hearing this, that'll be in what's after September?
October.
October. Thank you. Is there anything you would like people listening to look out for or check out?
Look out for Eileen the movie. It should be coming out, I think around Christmas time.
Do you have much involvement in it? Like,
Yeah,
all right.
I co-wrote it and was a producer.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I look forward to watching it too. Well, thank you and hope you have a good day.
Thank you.